too. Thank you plus.
Steve pointed out we can put the back.
No, it's very serious. Churches don't like, look what they did to Jesus. Look what my Jewish, you know, and actually Jesus is the most successful rabbi in Jewish history. But don't say that in the synagogue.
I'm just testing the camera. I'm not getting any. I don't like people drinking coffee or taking a bite. I delete those. I'm testing the white balance. Oh yeah, my mom too. That's why. Yeah. That's why I know the lady protocol. We watch our back. Yeah. We have a sign and everything.
Sizin sandalye burada galiba. Bir dakika.
YouTube. You might have. Oh, they have their. I think they have it kind of built in. I know that they do things here. I want to read. That's the only reason to do it.
Yeah, and they always publish it. Testing. Testing, test.
Good morning. Good morning. It's 10:15, Washington time, New Jersey time, East time, and 5:15 Jerusalem time, Ramallah time, Haifa time, and Amman time. Welcome and good morning to all of you to our 20th Holy Land Christian Ecumenical Foundation International Conference, highlighting Together in Faith, Jerusalem, our collective home. This year is special as it marks a milestone in our organizational life and our commitment to replace despair with hope, fear with human security, and humiliation with dignity. I'm Saliba Sarsar, Chair of the HCEF Committee on Research and Publication and Professor of Political Science at Monmouth University in New Jersey. And I'm here with Dr. Stephen Corbin, former Special Olympics Senior Vice President of Community Impact and Support, who is a Living Faith Lutheran Church elder. Both of us will ensure that the conference runs smoothly and in a timely manner. On behalf of the HCEF founder and president, Sir Ratib Rabi, the board of directors, and the conference planning committee, I thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Saliba. It's a great pleasure to work with you again on the conference. We've done this a few times before. 20 years goes very quickly, and it's been an important 20 years, and we hope that there's another 20 or more years going forward. The conference this year is held in partnership with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, and Know Thy Heritage, which is a program that was created by the Holy Land Christian Ecumenical Foundation a number of years ago. We extend our heartfelt thanks to them for their support, especially Dr. Shahor Awade, the Deputy Permanent Observer of the OIC to the United Nations, and the KTH Board. Similarly, we express our gratitude to the Jerusalem Fund for Education and Community Development and its Executive Director, Mohammed for hosting us, and also to Mohammed for making sure all of our electronic communications machinery here and far work today. We thank all the volunteers and those who are taking notes for our presentations and discussions. This includes Dr. Carol Monica Burnett, Miss Julia Pittner, and Miss Janice Childress. We're streaming live, and we want to mention that the ideas and opinions that are shared at this conference really are the viewpoints of the presenters and speakers, and not necessarily that of HCEF, OIC, KTH, or the Jerusalem Fund. But I think if you listen carefully, you'll see the simpaticos that leak over between official positions and heartfelt positions there. So it's not like we're just strangers remaining strangers. We're here for similar purposes. I'm going to welcome now Sir Ratib Rabi. He is going to essentially lead the opening ceremony. Sir Ratib is a knight of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He was one of the 4 or 5 founders of HCEF 20 years ago. He's the president and CEO, and sometimes I think the chairman and the on-the-ground coordinator, everything else. He's a one-man show, and he really has a lot of energy, even after 20 years. This opening session will also include His Excellency Agshin Mehidiev. This is not my native tongue. I'll get better as the day goes on. He's the ambassador and permanent observer of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation to the United Nations. Also His Excellency Ambassador Dr. Riyad Mansour, the permanent observer mission of the State of Palestine to the United Nations, and Her Excellency Dina Kawar, who's the ambassador of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Ratib.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad that you are all here. I am in an awkward position with all these diplomats, and I have to try to do my part before they start in order to make them look good. The thing here is that we've been 20 years working on this advocacy and developments of Jerusalem, because we focus on like the diocese of Jerusalem, which contain Jordan and Palestine together. We work on the refugees, we work on different things, you know, in Jordan. But on the other hand, that's we have about 20 programs and events around Palestine and internationally. I don't want to bore you with what we do, because you can see our websites and see what we do, but I'm here today, you know, about our 20th international conference, where really we want to make sure this is about Jerusalem, and with our partners, OIC and KTH, in order to highlight the daily developments on Jerusalem, because we feel as Palestinians, as Arabs, as Muslims, Christians, and Jews, we got together, you know, today and tomorrow also, in order to put our heads together and see how we can make sure this Jerusalem is for all, and this is how Jerusalem is going to be something we are all belong to. I'm not a clergy, you know. I'm not a politician. I'm not whatever you want to call this. I am a man with a mission, you know, where I want to make sure that we all understand that we need to make the changes, you know, in order for people to understand what Jerusalem means to us, as we want them to look at it differently, not what we hear in the news, what people decide about our faith, what people are looking at us as Christian, Muslims, or Jews, you know. Now, Jerusalem has to be shared, you know. This is what we believe in. Jerusalem has to have two people and three faiths, you know, and this is where all we are looking for. We don't want here, we need to share it, you know. Jesus Christ, as a Christian, you know, he's the prophet who spent all his time and was crucified and died and raised, you know, and that's all in Jerusalem, in the Holy Land, you know, I mean, in that area. That's mean we cannot claim it just for us because of that, because every religion has a stake into it. I would like, you know, to bring to your attentions that, you know, how we can from this conference, as is not only, it is the 20th anniversary for HCEF, we made it special that we are working with a lot of partners beside the OIC, the main one whose their interest and their mission is to, and created because of Jerusalem, actually, you know. I just, you know, this is, which is something really astonishing when you hear that. The other thing is to have the Episcopalians, I have the Lutherans, I have the Presbyterians. Did I say that again? You know, but, you know, I have the Catholics, you name it, and the other Muslims who are from different organizations too are with us. They come and go through the 2 days in order to come up with, I don't know what the word is, task force or something, where we all, Jews, Muslim, and Christians, to work on Jerusalem for all. And we are hoping that this conference will be the start for that, such as things like that. I want to thank you again all for coming. I want you to hear our official statements from our ambassadors, because after that we are going to get to work and see how we can make things better and get the word out. It is, like we said, live stream. It is a lot of people are watching us, and then we have already reached out thousands of people. We reached all the churches. We reached out to all the mosques, you know, in the country, and Islamic centers, just to know that there's something happening here in Washington, not just, we are here coming together just to spend 2 days talk about nothing. We need to come up with results, and we have a lot of leaders, and I have over 25 organizations represented through the 2 days. I'm happy to have you here, and thank you very much for being with us. God bless you all.
Thank you very much. Distinguished ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, friends, on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, as co-organizer of this event, I welcome you all. I wish also to express our appreciation for the Holy Land Christian Ecumenical Foundation's proactive role in supporting justice for Palestine in general and Jerusalem in particular. I cannot fail to thank Sir Ratib Rabi for his high spirit of cooperation and his team, especially at the Know Thy Heritage Initiative, for the excellent organization of this important event. Our thanks also go to all co-sponsors of the event and to the Jerusalem Fund for Education and Community Development for hosting our gathering. Last but not least, I'd like to thank Ambassador Riyad Mansour and Ambassador Dina Kawar for their presence with us. We are very proud to have this wide spectrum of partners. Our partnership for holding this conference today falls within the context of raising a joint voice in support of the city that brings us all together, Jerusalem. As certainly expected, one of the key themes that will probably be raised during this two-day conference is the significance of Jerusalem for the believers of all faiths all over the world. For Muslims, Jerusalem is a sacred and sanctified place, as it is the first Qibla. It's the city of which Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, led all prophets in a prayer during this nocturnal journey, known as Al-Isra wal-Miraj. It was in this journey that the Prophet received the divine revelation about the second pillar of Islam, which is to pray 5 times a day, a ritual performed for more than 14 centuries by more than 1.5 billion Muslims all over the world. While the spiritual significance of Jerusalem for the monotheistic religion will be touched upon by several speakers from different faiths during our conference, I would like to stress that Muslims' attachment to Al-Quds, Jerusalem, is deep and unshakable. In this sense, I would like to offer a fresh reminder that the cause of Al-Quds was the main catalyst for the very creation of the OIC about 5 decades ago. Al-Quds was then our organization's first and foremost cause, its very raison d'etre, and has been ever since the top item on its agenda. Bringing justice to Al-Quds, the protection and preservation of its Christian and Muslim holy places and shrines, the maintenance of its indigenous Palestinian identity, and its historical, cultural, and civilizational landmarks, as well as the staunch campaign to ensure its rightful return to the Palestinian sovereignty in conformity with the relevant international legitimacy resolutions, have been and shall always be the prime objectives in inspiring and propelling the OIC endeavors forward. Ladies and gentlemen, the late Palestinian leader, Faisal Husseini, once said, I quote, "If free and enjoying justice, Jerusalem can be the warm sun of the Middle East. But if not, it can become the black hole which can swallow everything, including the hope for peace." End of the quote. The distressing truth, however, is that Jerusalem is anything but the sun of the Middle East. The city of the prophets is a sad and torn town, and the suffering of its indigenous population, Muslim and Christians, goes beyond any imaginable depth. For more than 5 decades, Jerusalem's identity as a place for all believers has been relentlessly targeted with cruel Israeli attempts aimed at falsifying its history, tampering with its demographic fabric, and imposing an exclusive Jewish character on its authentic personality. Our meeting today comes at a time when the city of Jerusalem, which gathered all humanity in one ground, has lost its beauty. And in contrast with the name, Jerusalem has now become known for the unjust and unfair action of Israel. Therefore, the situation in occupied East Jerusalem remains a major concern for the OIC and its 57 member states. Israel violations in the Holy City are palpable and could readily be identified by the unprecedented intensification of Israeli extremism and solace, which has gone out of proportion in fiercely targeting the authentic character of the occupied city. Israel has systematically adopted political, demographic, and economic measures stated to alter the authentic historical and civilizational identity of East Jerusalem, Judaizing it, perverting its character, changing its landmark, depleting it from Palestinians, and isolating it from its Palestinian geographical environment. The sad reality is that religious rights of Palestinian citizens, Christians, and Muslims are severely violated by the occupying power. Due to the harsh Israeli measures, including the apartheid wall and military barriers, the vast majority of Palestinian Muslims and Christians from the West Bank and Gaza cannot reach their respective holy places in East Jerusalem. In addition, mosques and churches in Jerusalem have suffered from assaults and restrictions. Al-Aqsa Mosque, for example, was closed a number of times single last year by the Israeli military authorities. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was also targeted with several assaults. Last week, millions of people around the world watched the video showing Israeli police forces insulting and attacking Christian monks of the Coptic Church in East Jerusalem. Additionally, several Christian and Muslim religious endowment properties have been expropriated by the Israeli occupation authorities for building or expanding colonial settlements in and around Jerusalem. I am not going to burden you with figures and statistics about the situation in occupied East Jerusalem, and I will leave that for our knowledgeable speakers who will educate us on the state of affairs in Jerusalem. Nevertheless, for the sake of deliberation, I will mention a few examples about how Jerusalem is losing its multidimensional character due to a willful policy by the occupying power. For example, Israel has taken every measures to manipulate the demographics of occupied East Jerusalem by seeking to create a Jewish minority. This has been pursued through enacting discriminatory legislations, exploiting urban planning, and imposing several restrictions on residents' rights for the Palestinians. It's very upsetting to know that as a result of systematic policy, 123 Palestinian housing units were destroyed in 2016 alone, and more than 15,000 Palestinian homes where 100,000 Palestinians reside, representing a third of the Palestinian houses in Jerusalem, remain under the threat of demolition. At the same time, expropriated Palestinian land had been utilized for the construction of Israeli colonies, eventually leading to a sharp increase in the number of settlers who outnumber Palestinians in the city. Israel has been frantically suppressing any non-Jewish manifestation of Al-Quds, including the vital sectors that are a direct and integral component of the daily life of Palestinians. Ironically, Palestinians in East Jerusalem are required to pay taxes like Israeli settlers, but do not receive the same services. Education, for instance, has been suffering such a dearth of financial resources that school buildings in East Jerusalem are in state of dilapidation. The Israeli human rights organization Iramin estimates that as of 2017, there is a shortage of 2,557 classrooms in Palestinian neighborhoods, and about a third of the children do not complete 12 years of schooling. You can imagine the type of generation that is intended for the Jerusalemites by having intentional Israeli restriction on education. The healthcare sector in East Jerusalem, too, is by no means in a better shape. Due to Israel's cramping policies, Palestinian hospitals and community clinics in East Jerusalem have undergone extreme hardships that continue to hinder their ability to provide adequate health care to the Palestinian citizens. Hospitals, which are the main health care provider for the Palestinians, are under-equipped and need urgent upgrades. In addition, while Palestinians make up to 40% of Jerusalem population, the Israeli municipality runs only 6 family health centers in the Palestinian neighborhoods, as opposed to 27 centers in Jewish neighborhoods. Ladies and gentlemen, what I have mentioned are but a few examples of Israeli attempts to impose on the city an exclusive Jewish identity. What makes things worse for Jerusalem is the blind support that Israel receives from certain groups and states. Accepting Israel's jurisdiction over Jerusalem and recognizing it as Israel's capital will only fuel injustice. For the OIC, Jerusalem is the core of Palestinian existence, history and culture, and the cornerstone of peace. Taking it off the table is tantamount to taking peace off the table. Accepting Israel's illegal occupation of the city only means enforcing injustice, rewarding lawlessness, and punishing the victim. East Jerusalem is part of the occupied Palestinian land, capital of the state of Palestine, and should be dealt with in conformity of international legitimacy resolutions. I would not emphasize enough that it is incumbent on us all, Muslim and Christians, laity and clergy, individuals and states, to do our best to restore the inclusiveness that Jerusalem represents. It's the duty of all of us to work together to safeguard the authentic identity of the city, which was gifted to humanity by God. It's our duty to make sure that the city enjoys its multicultural identity. It's the city that belongs to us all and should be served by all of us. Our final call is that we should work together to build a global coalition to educate the entire world about the suffering of East Jerusalem under occupation and the oppression the Palestinian Jerusalemites endure therein. I thank you for your attention. Thank you. Thank you.
Good morning. Allow me at the beginning to express our gratitude to the organizers of this 20th International Conference, and also to express my personal gratitude to my brother Ratib Rabia for inviting me to represent the people and leadership of the State of Palestine and to be with you in this very important conference. Allow me also to thank you, or not to thank you, to congratulate you for convening this 20th conference for your organization. And also I'm delighted that I am sharing the podium with colleagues. Dina is my sister and she is my good friend. We served together in New York when she was the PR of Jordan in New York, and she is in Washington, D.C. And it is always a delightful thing to see you, Dina, and to share with you things that are very important to both of our people and leadership. And by that, I mean the question of Jerusalem. Of course, you know, Afshin is a good friend, and we work together in New York, and we appreciate what the OIC has been doing in defending Jerusalem and the just cause of the Palestinian people. Of course, I'm not going to educate you about the value and importance of Jerusalem for people of faith, especially for those who aspire to Christianity. You are better educated than me of the meaning of Jerusalem and the holy value of that city which belongs to humanity and which is a place that by many theologians is considered as the holiest house of God when he decides to come to earth. It is, in Arabic we call it Bayt al-Maqdis. It is the holy house. It is the holy house for those who follow the three religions. So I am not going to dwell on the importance of Jerusalem. But what I want to concentrate my remarks about is related to what is really happening to Jerusalem today and what should we all do in order to put an end to this tragedy that the Palestinian people have been going through for more than 70 years since the Nakba and 50 years since the occupation. And also to find a just, fair solution to the question of Jerusalem based on international law, based on fairness and justice, and based on making it a city for all those who would love to have a spiritual connection with it. We cannot deny billions of people to have spiritual connection with Jerusalem. But what we object to is that that connection should not be translated into a real state control of the city. The city belongs to the people who live in the city and own the properties, own the history, and they have been living there for hundreds and hundreds of years. That is the connection for those who live there. But if you are from Indonesia and you are a Muslim, you have the full right to have a spiritual connection with Jerusalem. If you are from Chile and you have the full right to have a spiritual connection with Jerusalem, and if you are from Warsaw and you are Jewish, you have the full right to have a spiritual connection with that city, but that should not translate into a group to come and to take it from the people who have been living there for a long period of time under any kind of logic and explanation to justify that action. This has nothing to do with the essence of religion. It has nothing to do with the essence of spiritual connection with this holy city. It has to do with many other things, and you know exactly what I mean by that. Now, what is the status of Jerusalem in contemporary today as it relates to international law? It was decided in 1947 that the international community, justly or not justly, when they decided to partition Palestine into three pieces, 2 states, and a special status to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is a very sensitive issue, not only to the two people, the Israelis and the Palestinians, but it is a very sensitive, important issue to humanity. And those who decided, to partition Palestine and to create an international administration for Jerusalem at that time, they realized that keep Jerusalem that way until the situation is ripe, where the two peoples and humanity as a whole can find a solution where Jerusalem will be the jewel of humanity and the capital of everything good that all of us aspire to. Now, after that, Israel not only took most of Palestine, 78% in 1948-49, but in 67 took the remaining part of Palestine, including East Jerusalem. International law stipulates that the status of the occupied territory, including East Jerusalem, is occupied territory, regardless of what Israel thinks, regardless of the articulation of the position of Israel, based on things that perhaps dates back to thousands of years ago, the status, according to international law, according to the United Nations, that we collectively created after World War II, is an occupied territory. And also, the Charter of the UN, which is a fabulous document that regulates relationship between nations and people on the basis of the inadmissibility of the acquisition of land by force, and on the basis of trying to resolve complicated issues and disputes through peaceful measures in order to save humanity from having wars similar to the one that happened in World War I and in World War II. Noble ideas. And we collectively reached an agreement that was signed in San Francisco in 1945 by the nations that established the United Nations. So this collective effort that was translated into this fabulous document, which is the Charter of the United Nations, it is not a book or a document that you read it when you like, you accept it when you like, and you throw it in the garbage when you like. It doesn't work that way. That is the rule of those who are not civilized. That is the rule of the jungle. That is the rule of might is over right. And we should not accept it, because if we accept such an articulation, then why did we establish the United Nations to begin with? So having said that, then rooted in that document, which is not a document that we, the Palestinian people, created, drafted, or played an instrumental role in adopting it. It was other countries, led by the United States of America. So we believe, and many nations believe, that this document should be honored and respected. Based on that document, the land that was occupied on the 4th of June 1967, which constitute for us the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, is an occupied territory, and this occupation should be of a temporary nature and should be terminated, and the relationship between the people who live under occupation and the people who are occupying them, or the government that represent the occupying authority, should be guided by a set of international rules and regulations that would allow the occupiers to do certain things and would forbid them from doing other things. One of the things that they're not allowed to do is to annex East Jerusalem. One of the things that they're not allowed to do is to transfer population from their country, from Israel, to the occupied Palestinian territory and to establish illegal settlements. So this is the law. And we are not inventing something that Israel can claim that this is the invention of the thinking of the Palestinian people. This is international law. This is what all nations should honor and respect. And this is, by the way, a condition for countries and states to qualify to be member of the United Nations. Now, after 67, I said, by the early 80s, Israel, the occupying power, decided to annex East Jerusalem. That was not accepted by the entire international community. It was not accepted by the Security Council, which adopted two resolutions, 476 and 478, which one stipulates that any change, any legal change of the status of Jerusalem is null and void, and it has no legal ramification. And the other one stipulates that if a state to violate this law and to move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, it should take it back to Tel Aviv immediately. In fact, in the 80s, two states violated international law, Costa Rica and El Salvador, and moved their embassies to Jerusalem. And then years later, these two states honor and respected international law and their obligation under the provisions of the Charter of the UN, and removed their embassies back from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. It was tragic and sad and dangerous to see a country of the magnitude of the United States of America to violate US policies that have been put in place since 1945 and since 1947, because the United States of America was the country that drafted Resolution 181 that gave Jerusalem a special status until there is a readiness by humanity to accept a solution by all of us, by the Palestinians, by the Israelis, by the Arabs, by the Jordanians, by humanity as a whole, to the question of Jerusalem. And that was the policy of the United States of America all along. And the United States of America did not veto Resolution 476 and 478 or Resolution 2334, which was adopted in December 23 of 2016, which stipulates the principles that I mentioned contained in the Charter of the UN in the inadmissibility of the acquisition of land by force, and that the border is the 4th of June, 1967, including, of course, East Jerusalem being occupied, and any change to that situation will not be accepted unless the two parties, through negotiation, to agree to some changes of the borders. So this is international law. This is the position of the international community. And that is the position that should be respected by everyone, including the leadership of the United States of America and all others who say that they respect the rule of law, they honor and respect international law, and they honor and respect the position of law in regulating relationship between nations, and not to be a country to violate international law, to violate Security Council resolutions, and come and lecture the rest of us saying that they're doing the right thing and the good thing when they interfere in this area or that area. Now, having said that, of course, on December 6, when the current US administration decided to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of the State of Israel, and decided and implemented moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, as I think that Afshin said, if you remove Jerusalem from the table, there is nothing left on the table to talk about. And what is really dangerous about this thing, you give this gift to the Israeli occupying authorities in exchange of nothing. And you claim that you do that along with removing the refugees from the table, trying to destroy UNRWA, and therefore removing it from the table, and tell us, and in the same time, we are told that this would help peace. How could it help peace when you give the Israeli occupying authority, this extreme rightist government in Israel, all these gifts for nothing? What is the incentive for Prime Minister Netanyahu to come and negotiate with us? Any sane person, any reasonable person, if you want to give a gift to someone for the purpose of inducing them to move in the direction of peace, you let them pay a price. But when you give it to them for free, why should they come and participate in any meaningful process? And because of this kind of irresponsible, provocative policy, the current Israeli government went even one step further. They haven't done that in 70 years, but they did it recently in legislating the nationality law, in which they are legislating a system of segregation, apartheid in Israel, in which only one component of the population is allowed to practice self-determination, which is the Jews, depriving 25% of the population in Israel from such a thing, along with those who live in East Jerusalem and the Palestinian people who live in the rest of the occupied territory, because the same piece of legislation of nationality stipulates that it is the responsibility of the government of Israel to advance the cause of the Jews in Eretz Israel, in the land of Israel. It means the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. Now, we observe the situation. What should we do? And here I'm addressing you as active members in society in the United States, and I assume many of you are active followers of the Christian faith. You have brothers and sisters in Palestine who are Christians. They are in Jerusalem, they are in Bethlehem, they are in many other towns and villages in Palestine who are Christian. They have been there for 2,000 years. And we, the Palestinians, regardless of our religious affiliation, we are the descendants of the Canaanites. We've been living there for 5,000 years or longer. And we, the majority of us, at one time accepted a new religion that came to us through Abraham, which is Judaism later on. And then the majority of us became Christian. And then the majority of us became, Muslims. But we are the people of that land. And to deny us the right to self-determination as the indigenous population is nothing to be described other than apartheid. Apartheid, in the last 200 years, was defeated by humanity at least in two large locations. One, when there was slavery in the United States and the system of segregation, the movement in the United States of civil rights, maybe many of you were active members of that movement, defeated that system of segregation and discriminating against people on the basis of the color of their skin. And you elevated yourself to a remarkable level when you elected an Afro-American as a president of your country. It means that you were striving to be a better union, better United States of America. That is remarkable, that is inspiring. And then when this system was legislated in South Africa, it did not last for long, and it was defeated. Now it has been legislated for the third time in contemporary history in Israel, and I can assure you it will be defeated, and you are invited to do everything possible in order to contribute to that process. You are a very influential group of people. The people of faith are not only the evangelicals in certain parts of the South and in other parts of the United States of America. There are millions more who are of different denominations. You have a duty to defend Jerusalem, to make it the city for all of us, not to concede that it was given to only one group at the expense of others, at the expense of humanity. You have a duty, you have a responsibility to do that with all the people that you come in contact with, whether you are elected officials or your congregations and the people that come to your place of worship. You have a duty not just only to listen to information about what is just and what is not just, although this is important, but you have to take the additional step of doing things in order really not to let the Palestinian people be in this predicament alone, but to do whatever you can to correct this wrong policy by the current US administration and to leave Jerusalem on the table. It is, after all, one of the final status issues, and it should be dealt with after we put an end to occupation and to have two states living side by side in peace and dignity, and then we deal with all final status issues, including Jerusalem, to find a solution not only acceptable to the two people and to the two states, but acceptable to humanity as a whole. It is not an easy task, but it is a task that we have to accomplish if we want to honor and respect Jerusalem and to give it the place that it deserves in our hearts and minds and in the history of humanity. We count a lot on you. We had conferences in this country. I attended one in Atlanta in the center of President Carter, in which the 5 heads of our churches in Jerusalem came and met with heads of churches in the United States of America. We had a conference recently in Houston with different churches in the United States. Conferences and meetings are taking place among Christian faith in all corners of the United States of America. It should be galvanized in a very formidable movement. You are strong. You can influence people. You have a duty to do it, and you have to influence also the government, not only to, to accept that, well, let's pray for Jerusalem, and that's enough. That is not enough. You have to do more than that. And I speak to you from the essence of the pain of the Palestinian people, from the essence of the pain of your brothers and sisters who are Christians in the Holy Land and who are Muslim in the Holy Land, to defend Jerusalem and to open doors for a meaningful political process that would lead to the end of occupation, the independence of the state of Palestine with East Jerusalem as its capital. And I thank you very much.
First of all, thank you. That was interesting. I know Riyadh from my days in New York, and we worked so much together on the issue of Jerusalem. Anyway, thank you very much, Ratib, for inviting me and including me in today's event, 20th anniversary, I suppose, and to everybody who's here, including my fellow colleagues, ambassadors. Obviously, the question of Jerusalem has been explained and in quite a extensive manner. So I only would want to add one aspect, which is Jerusalem's, the Jordanian Hashemite role in Jerusalem, and it has been a historic role. As most of you know, the Hashemite family has been guardians of the holy places. It's a historical role that has been ongoing since 1924, and it includes the Muslim as well as the Christian places. And with our Palestinian neighbors and family, we really actually run Jerusalem in the most efficient manner, and our policy is that we hope that one day East Jerusalem will be the capital of Palestine, and then we would be able to have saved the holy places. His Majesty and President Abbas in 2013 met and redefined the role and actually I wouldn't say redefined, but reaffirmed the role of the Hashemites as custodians and as the partners to make sure that the holy places are well kept. Jordan has also, in the same aspect, in 1981, registered and inscribed the old city of Jerusalem on UNESCO's World Heritage site as a site, and in 1982 as a site in danger, which is a specific category within the UNESCO statuses to explain that there needs to be an extra effort to safeguard the holy places. Now, throughout the years, the resolutions within the UN are known, the security, in both the executive board and in the World Heritage. We've done many resolutions, and I've worked very long years on those resolutions as 12 years in UNESCO ambassador with my Palestinian colleagues. And we, all these efforts in most and all of the resolutions, and especially the latest ones, reaffirmed that all legislative and administrative measures and actions taken by Israel, the occupying power, which have altered or purport to alter the character and the status of the holy city of Jerusalem, are null and void and must be resigned forthwith. Now, we believe that the status of Jerusalem, as mentioned before me, is one of the final status. It's the same position that we have with what Riyadh mentioned and what my colleague from the OIC mentioned, and that it can only be discussed and negotiated in a final status Jerusalem. I want to also remind the Christian members assisting today in the conference that the Christian holy sites are also under our care, and His Majesty did in 2016 put in his personal contribution to support the funding and the restoration of Christ's Holy Tomb in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. So this, for him, the question of Christians in Jerusalem is vital because they are the reminder of what the city architecture is, and the city architecture of it having the three religions is major and has to maintain that way. So we are saddened much of the time to see that the number of Christians in Jerusalem is decreasing continuously. The figures I have here is about 300,000 plus. I don't know if Riyadh, is that the figure that you have of in Jerusalem?
The total population of
yeah, the Christian. Yeah, the total is 300 and how much?
40%
yeah.
Palestinian Christian and Muslims. Yeah. 40% of the total population.
Yeah. So
10,000 Christians, 300,000 Muslims.
Exactly. So, but the numbers of Christians are decreasing for economic reasons as well, and most of the time, the departure of Christians in Jerusalem is for economic reasons, and they end up in the United States and Canada, and they have diminishing the number of the Christians there. So I think this is what I have to say as from the Jordanian point of view, because the historical, the political aspects has been touched upon by Riyadh, but all to say that we're hoping that there would be a return as soon as possible to some kind of a peace track between both the Palestinians and the Israelis, and in which us, Jordan, we feel highly concerned because many of these status issues, the final status issues, do touch on Jordan, be it in the refugee issues, be it in borders, be it in security, be it in the issue of Jerusalem and our role in Jerusalem. So I would be very curious and interested to follow from far about your deliberations this time and see how it goes. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to the distinguished panel. You've given us a lot of food for thought, and it's a good launching and a basis for reflection, and hopefully a basis for action that will happen as we go from here. A great opening. I just want to comment on the characterization of the situation in Palestine politically as an apartheid situation. And I find that basic logic tells me it meets all the historical examples and criteria for what apartheid is. Sometimes there is a reluctance in the West to use the term apartheid and to make it some sort of legalistic, rhetorical flourish. Oh, we can't go that far. Oh, that would be too offensive. Oh, that won't be collaborative. That undermines the apartheid conception that existed in South Africa or in the United States during the 19th century. But truly, accepting that term as logical, accurate, and useful to having a conversation with people that are not well informed about this subject, I think is a good strategy, because apartheid, the term apartheid, is a term that resonates very negatively, I think, in much of the Western world and Europe and elsewhere. So we have to be comfortable with putting that out there. Uncomfortable that it's there, but comfortable talking about it. Before we continue the program, we have many more outstanding speakers. I think there's 25 speakers in the 2 days of the conference, which is a lot to take in. I want to mention that all the sessions will be here at the Jerusalem Fund, and the lunch will also be here at the Jerusalem Fund. As you saw in the hallway, there are items for sale, including books that you can buy, and one of the books is a new one specifically about Jerusalem. Also materials from the Washington Report on the Middle East Affairs. Please be sure to speak with Sir Rateb Rabi during the breaks if you have an interest in becoming involved with HCEF in any way, including as a volunteer or offering some sort of support. All of the speakers that are going to be presenting here, we have extensive biographies on them in the program book for the conference. So we're not going to go through in lengthy descriptions of that in order to facilitate the sessions, but you can find it in there, and I ask you to refer to that. Most panels will have time for questions and answers, unfortunately, not the first one here. We need to stay on track. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, there's a microphone here. Please speak up so that the people that are on the live stream, as well as the folks that are here in the room, can hear your comment or your question. We thank all the volunteers from this organization who are here with their name badges on. They can answer questions for us. And we really appreciate the energy that they've thrown into making a comfortable convening for us today. We'll try to stay on schedule all day long because we are scheduled up all the way to the end. And there is another event this evening for some people that will be headed out toward Bethesda. Saliba?
I'll grab him.
He's probably writing another poem. He's our poet laureate for HCEF.
Thank you very much, Steve. Together in faith, Jerusalem, our collective home. This theme is important to consider at this time in our troubled history, as it highlights our faiths and how we are tied to each other through shared beliefs and values. Jerusalem, the city of God, the city of humanity, equally informs who we are, as it is our collective home. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, let my tongue stick to my palate, if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my greatest joy. Psalm 137. When the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place. And suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. And divided tongues as of fire appeared to them and rested on each of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. Acts 2, 1-47. Glory to He, God, who did take His servant from a journey by night, from the sacred mosque to the farthest mosque, whose precincts we did bless. Quran 17:1. Our collective responsibility towards our faiths and toward each other, and our commitment to Jerusalem as the city of peace, give us meaning and guidance as we meet to share ideas and plans, or as we put our faith into action. Jerusalem, as has become obvious, or as is obvious to all of us, is the spiritual home of the three monotheistic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In this panel coming up, Christian and Muslim leaders will share their views on the holy and human city and what Christians and Muslims can do to preserve its soul and spirit before it is too late. Now it gives me great pleasure to welcome Father Michael McDonough, who is from Jerusalem, residing in Jerusalem for many years, to the podium to start the plenary session and introduce the session speakers. Father McDonough is Senior Advisor to the Apostolic Administrator of the Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem and Archbishop of Jerusalem. Father McDonough.
Good morning. I have to correct something there that I know Rateb inserted into the bulletin that I was a senior advisor. I'm not even a minor advisor to the Apostolic Administrator. When I get back to Jerusalem, he'll come into my office and say, "Since when did I promote you?" So just to disclaim that particular title that Rateb has so kindly ascribed to me. It's a pleasure to be a moderator of this particular session because the book that was published recently by HCEF touched on a subject that is dear to me, having lived there for 19 years. But yes. A very special city, as you well know, and one that maybe a brief word before introducing our first speaker. One of the difficulties I found, particularly with Christians outside of the Middle East, is this term chosen, a chosen people, a chosen race, a chosen nation. Chosen doesn't mean simply somebody selecting you. What the most important part of chosen is that you respond to the one who chose you on the basis of the one who chose you. Being chosen to be a holy nation, and that's the term that is being used here of the holy city, is that we must be holy according to the one who designed it. The boast must not be in technology, must not be in medical advancement, must not be in anything that has its origin very much in human minds. It's to be a people set apart for a purpose, and the purpose is to be godly, to show to the world the holiness, the integrity, the justice, the peace, the purity of a God who chooses a people. So it's a very demanding position, but sadly that has been totally abandoned, and unfortunately many Western Christians haven't understood either their role as Christians to be reflections of God in the world, but have delighted in a very partisan and political view of a biblical notion that doesn't live today. So onward with the presentation this morning. Our panel, as you can read from the program that you have there, there's no need for me to repeat it, but rather to start with our first speaker, Imam Yahya Hendi, if he is here. Would he jump? Oh, right here. I beg your pardon? Can you call them Sure, all of them. Dr. David Renwick, the Imam, if you would please come forward. I think you see your names there, not from the back of the panels, but Father Drew Christensen and Bishop, His Excellency, Bishop Richard Graham. One of the reminders of my homiletics teacher in the seminary was always remember the 3 B's. Be bright, be brief, and be gone. So I'm not going to tell that to the panelists, although they have already heard it from me. So it's a nasty way of conveying a message, isn't it? So yes, just after this. They will have, is it 8 minutes? If there will be a question and answer time after this. I think the ambassadors had to go and the time was a little delayed in starting the early session, so there wasn't time for question and answer. But if you have questions, I'm sure our panelists will be happy to comment on them. So, Imam, may I introduce you? Come forward and share with us your pearls of wisdom.
Thank you, Father. Before I say anything, I wanted to apologize for having to leave right after my presentation. only because today is Friday and I have a community waiting on me to lead them. So I have to leave, but I will be back in the afternoon. It's my loss that I would not be around to listen to my colleagues here speaking. In my presentation, I will not use the word Jerusalem. I would rather use the word Al-Quds, because for me that is more meaningful, not only because of my Arabic tongue, but because of the meaning of the word Al-Quds, the holy, from Quddus and Muqaddas and Kadosh in Hebrew, that it is a holy city. Hoping to start today with that holiness point of view, reflecting on the need to keep the city holy and what that means, to keep our relationship to it holy and what that means to us. For a few minutes, I want to reflect on what the city means to Muslims. Then I'll offer a few points on what I hope we do. Number one, the city is called Al-Qibla Al-Ula, the first direction of the prayer for Islam. Prophet Muhammad, peace be with him, preached Islam for 23 years, 13 in Mecca and 10 in Medina. For the 13 years of Mecca, the direction to prayer was Al-Quds. For 18 months in Medina, the direction to prayer was to Al-Quds, which means that 68% of the time of the Prophet's preaching and ministry was when Muslims were asked and expected to pray towards Al-Quds. That is almost 68%. That's not an easy number. For Islam, this means that Islam wants us to connect between Mecca and Al-Quds in order to understand that Mecca is holy, so is Al-Quds. But also to understand that as Muslims, we have to find the way to connect between these two holy cities. In other words, Islam expected itself to be a unifying faith that brings these two cities together, hoping that its adherents, or those who believe in Islam, would actually take that city seriously, the city of Al-Quds. Number two, you heard earlier a reference to Al-Isra and Al-Mi'raj called the night journey. Muslims believe that Prophet Muhammad at one point was taken up to heavens through Jerusalem. I always, when I preach about this to my students, I say, God, with God's power, could have taken Muhammad directly up to heavens, not through Al-Quds. One push of a button from God, Muhammad could have been to Mecca. Why is it that God chose to take him to Jerusalem first, from Jerusalem up to heavens? Well, Muhammad may have been tired by then. He might have wanted to come back to Mecca directly, you know, when we choose flights and traveling. But God took him even from heavens to Jerusalem, back to Mecca. Is that a message, according to theologians, for Islam and for Muslims to believe that the center of Islam is the city of Al-Quds, that the way to heavens goes through Al-Quds, the way to our humanity goes through Al-Quds, the way to peace and justice goes through Al-Quds? Because during that night, the Prophet was asked of a specific theological and moral teachings, all of which evolve around the concept of justice. Is God telling Muslims that in order to care for justice, they need to care for Al-Quds? Is God telling Muslims that the way to heavens goes through Al-Quds and the way to justice goes through Al-Quds? That's an important theological point in Islam. Number three, always referred to as the city of Moses or the city of Jesus. Not only Al-Quds, but the cities around and the area around. For Islam, Moses is a part of the Muslim theology and the creed. Jesus is a part of our theology. Abraham is a part of our Muslim theology. Isaac and Jacob are a part of our Muslim theology. And therefore, whether it is the Christian call or the Jewish call, their call is also a part of our call. That is to say, we are all united in our love of the city of Al-Quds, and those who claim that city, whether Moses, who aspired to go to Jerusalem, or Al-Quds, or Jesus, who lived in the city of Al-Quds. Maybe that is the reason for why Umar, the second caliph of Islam, chose Al-Quds to be the only city to which he traveled after he became the Khalifa. When the Muslim military expanded through the region, through what is known now as Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and Palestine and Egypt and you name it, the only city the caliph chose to travel to receive from its inhabitants, to celebrate, was the city of Al-Quds. Maybe that's why Umar refused to pray in the church of Holy Sepulchre. Not because he thought, as he was asked, why is it that you don't want to pray in our church? Is it dirty? Is it not good enough? He said, no. On the contrary. I am afraid that if I pray in the church, some of my followers will take that as an excuse to turn it to a mosque. I want it to remain as a church. Actually, I am here to protect the church, to care for the church. He prayed a few yards away to what now is known as Masjid Umar. Actually, in Bethlehem, also across from the church of Nativity there, you have the Mosque of Umar, believed to have been ordered by Umar to be built next to the church. That was the way Umar understood himself, to be someone who was entrusted with Al-Quds and Palestine, not to force its inhabitants to become Muslims, but rather to enforce justice, equality, and full access to all holy sites. Al-Quds became so much important in the Muslim psyche, enough that for whether the caliph in Al-Quds, in Damascus or in Baghdad, or earlier in Al-Medina, to be called a mufti at one point in that history, you have to have been inaugurated or endorsed from Al-Quds. And every mufti to have become a mufti in any region, he had to go through Al-Quds first, and saw himself to become better mufti, if you will, more endorsed, more qualified, if he was at one point the mufti of Al-Quds. So to become the mufti of Basra or Mosul or Damascus or Cairo, you have to become the mufti of Al-Quds first. If you read the writings of Imam al-Ghazali about the impact of the city of Al-Quds on his own spiritual writings on Islamic mysticism, if you read the Imam Hanbali's writings, Imam Shafi'i's writings, of how they were inspired by the city of Al-Quds. In the Quran, Surah 95, called At-Tin, the figs. If you have never been to Palestine, you need to go, and when you do, please go in the summer to eat the figs of Palestine. And I hope you all have in your homes olive oil from the olives of Palestine. In the chapter 95, God speaks of the importance of Wattini wa Zaytun, the importance and the significance of the figs and the olives of Al-Quds and the surrounding area, and that God connects between these two fruits and Sinai, the religious environmental aspect of Al-Quds. 2 minutes, oh my God. Never give the microphone to a clergy. Surah Al-Isra, which is exactly in the middle of the Quran. It's the surah that talks about the importance of Al-Quds to Islam and to Muslims. Is it because Muslims are expected to take Al-Quds to their hearts, care for it, protect it, honor it, and keep it Al-Quds? To conclude, within that surah, the Quran expects those who care for Al-Quds to live specific morals and values, such as care for refugees and care for the needy, caring for senior citizens, doing all that which is good, not giving too much voice to the rich as much as to the poor, and not to be arrogant in the land. From all of this, I think as Muslims are expected, in order to keep the city holy, to ensure that it is a city that is holy to all, that gives access to all, not only to Jews, not only to Christians, not only to Muslims. I say, as a Muslim, as an imam from a Palestinian background, as a chaplain, as a religious leader in my community, I cannot wait for the day to have the state of Palestine with the capital Al-Quds. Muslims are all united as freedom and justice seekers in our demand for Al-Quds to be the eternal capital of Palestine. Muslims accept nothing less, and we do not compromise on this demand. We want a state of Palestine where the followers of all religions can freely pray to their God, the God of all of us. My last point is this, a Jewish prayer actually. Hashanaha ba'aba Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. This is a prayer that was first offered in Sinai. I tell my Jewish friends, do you want to be in Jerusalem alone? I hope not. I tell my Christian friends, do you want to be in Al-Quds alone? I hope not. I tell Muslims, do you want to be in Al-Quds alone? I hope not. Because this prayer says this, next year in Jerusalem only as one family. Mishbacha ikhad. Aila wahida, usra wahida. That belongs to the father and the mother of that city. Abraham, Hagar, and Sarah. And they will only be happy. They will only be delighted if their brothers, if their children can unifiedly work together to ensure that the city is protected by all, but it's also open to all, where all manage it, all run it, all care for it. So I say, never dream of that city for only yourself. Hopefully, we can be united with one voice, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, for a one Al-Quds. And hopefully Palestinians will soon have their own capital in Al-Quds. As a Palestinian, I cannot wait for that moment to happen. As a universal scholar, an international scholar, whatever you want to call it, I cannot wait for the moment when I am freely able to go into the Church of Holy Sepulchre, into the Church of Nativity, into the Aqsa Mosque, and worship without having to be told, go back because you are a Muslim, or go back because you are a Christian. I just have to say this because for my Christian friends here, my friends, I want the state of Palestine, but not only for Muslims, for you too. And therefore, let's work together to build that state for you, for us, for me, for you, because we are all in this together. Thank you.
Thank you, Imam. Dr. David, Senior Pastor of the National Presbyterian Church here in Washington, very special welcome.
Thank you.
Let me begin my words by saying that our congregation has had a 20-year connection with the Holy Land Christian Ecumenical Foundation, and it's wonderful to be able to share in this celebration. And in particular, we've had a connection with Our Lady Queen of Peace Church in Birzeit and with the community center there for seniors, in which we've invested and shared in trips when we have been not only to Israel but to the Palestine and the West Bank as well. Let me just add as well that my words are not, first of all, political. And as I think about Jerusalem, I suppose I could have gone in the direction of the prophets to speak about justice, but I'm not going to speak so much about justice, and I'm not going to give a political view. But I'm going to share today a theological view which not all Presbyterians might agree with. I'm going to describe myself as a Protestant Presbyterian low church Christian. Now, for some of you, that may not make much sense, but that's where I'm going to begin my remarks, by describing myself in that way, and to say that for all my early life, this meant that Jerusalem as a city was of no more significance to me than any other city. Significant, yes, but from a religious, theological point of view, no more than any other. And this was the case until my early 40s, and I'd like to explain in my remarks what I'm going to say. And in some ways, these remarks are going to be quite contrasting with what you have just said. In contrast to many of my Christian Catholic and Orthodox friends, in contrast to High Church Episcopalians and perhaps some Lutherans as well, and in contrast to Muslims, as we have just heard, and to many Jews, to believers in many other forms of religion, for a Protestant, Presbyterian, low church Christian, particular places are not deemed to be any more holy than any other place. This is of real importance in the way that we think. No place is no more holy than any other. Of interest, yes. Of great importance, yes. Of significance, yes. But in terms of theological holiness, no. For example, we do not have cathedrals that have been sanctified in any way. We have church buildings which are functional, useful for the gathering of the community, to hear the word of God read and proclaimed. Some churches, like my present church here in Washington, stray from this simplicity. They have stained glass windows. They have some semblance of ornate beauty. But for hundreds of years, the model was more akin to the simple structures of New England churches, with no stained glass windows, no cruciform shape, no high vaulted ceiling, indeed no liturgical elements except for a simple communion table, not an altar, a baptismal font or bowl, a pulpit or a lectern of some kind, and many did not even have a cross. For me and my kind, none of these ornamentations really mattered, because no particular places, not even churches, are particularly holy. This means that we, and I'm going to say it again, Protestant, Presbyterian, low church Christians, I do not claim to speak for all Christians, but for a group within the Christian faith, Christians do not even go on pilgrimages. There are no sites, no distant places that are any more holy than where we are right now. We have no equivalent of Lourdes where we can be in a place of miracles. We have no equivalent of Medjugorje or Jerusalem where we can be in a place of sightings or of visions. True, some Presbyterians may make the equivalent of pilgrimages to places like Geneva in Switzerland, where our theological forefather John Calvin hung out, or to my hometown of Edinburgh in Scotland, where another theological forefather, John Knox, hung out. But Geneva is not deemed to be in any sense holy, and even the city of Edinburgh, unless you come from there, is not deemed to be any more holy than any other particular place. So where is holiness to be found? Or the equivalent question, where is God to be found? Well, first of all, in the divine presence itself, and by extension for Christians, in the person of Jesus, and through Jesus, primarily in people, individuals made in the image of God, and in whose lives God, by his Holy Spirit, longs to live, both as individuals and as a community. It is no accident that Jesus says, where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am That is where I will be. This is where holiness abides, in the individual and in the community. In this view, let me say it again, Jerusalem is of interest historically, but not as a place of particular pilgrimage or holiness. So in my early years, I had no great desire to go to or know about or even encounter Jerusalem or the Christians living in the Holy Land, the living stones, any more than any other Christians living in any other place or people living in any other place. I've always been fascinated by the world that God made. So this is not to say this is of no interest, but of special interest, extra interest. No. This was how I used to think, and to a certain extent, I still think this way. However, as I have continued to read Scripture, and as I've traveled to Israel and Palestine, I've begun to moderate my view, or at least to balance it, and perhaps say these words to perhaps balance things from the other side as well. In particular, I began to believe that while in the New Testament part of the Bible, Jesus makes promises to be present with his people everywhere, starting, as we heard, in Jerusalem, but then going out to the ends of the earth. Nevertheless, this promise does not completely undo the fact that in the Old Testament part of the Bible, God's people meet God in particular places, such as Jacob's experience of God's presence as a place called Bethel, not far from modern-day Burzynski, or that Solomon's prayer at the dedication of the temple, and we've just heard this in terms of the Muslim experience, was one in which he counseled people to turn to Jerusalem, al-Quds, to say their prayers. Indeed, it is clear from the Bible that for a period of 1,000 years, from the reign of King David until the time of Christ, God's promised presence was in fact linked to Jerusalem and to its Solomonic temple, a very specific place. And further, that this specific place, its destruction and restoration, provide the focal point of so much of the Old Testament prophetic and historical books. I could give you more details, but we'll just say that this is a major theme as it goes through the Scripture. It was about 25 years ago now that these passages about God's concrete love for and action in a particular place began to function for me as a counterbalance to what remains for me profoundly important. God is everywhere and anywhere, that people are more holy than places, by reminding me of the critical truths that God is not just spiritual, though God is spirit, the Scripture is clear, but God is creator, passionate about the material world, the real world in which we live, and furthermore incarnational, passionate about entering the material world, and thus vitally interested in experiencing the down-to-earth, concrete, and often painful realities of everyday life. God longs to experience those, to be a part of the solution, and not merely to be off in the distance. Life that involves real and specific people and places, organizations, structures of justice, and unfortunately injustice in the world. So Jerusalem and the land as a whole became increasingly important to me as a type of sacrament, a tangible reminder of the incarnational creator God who acts in real time and history, even taking on flesh and blood in the specific person of Jesus in a specific place, Galilee and Judea, and of course Jerusalem, not standing aloof, but entering in to any place in which there are people who need the presence of the living God and who suffer from their own sin and from the sins of others, which manifests itself in personal relationships gone askew and in systems and structure gone askew. So this has been my view. It has been changing along the way, but still remains a foundation in my life. Where does holiness reside? I think is, in fact, a key question for this whole discussion on the city, but not as something which distracts us from the real world in which God works, in which there is justice and injustice, and into which God calls us. I'm always reminded of the great vision of Jerusalem that we find in the last book of the Bible in the New Testament in Revelation, which should be an inspiration not to leave this world and head off to heaven too quickly, but to bring as much of heaven down to earth as we possibly can, as Jesus himself came to earth. So St. John writes in Revelation, and with this I conclude, Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them as their God. They will be his peoples. God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear away from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more. For the first things have passed away. The one who was seated on the throne said, See, I am making all things new. While we have breath within us, we are to do this wherever we can. What better place to do this than in this city to which our Lord Jesus came? Thank you.
Father Drew, thank you, Dr. David, for that provoking set of comments. The distinguished professor from Georgetown University, Father Drew.
Thank you, Michael. This weekend's conference is a special interreligious event. We gather as Muslims and Christians in response to a unilateral decision of the United States to recognize Jerusalem as the eternal united capital of Israel, an act that dismisses the part of the holy city in the spiritual heritage of Muslims and Christians and devalues its biblical character as a city holy to the entire human race. In recent weeks, the administration has added insult to injury by moving the U.S. consulate to East Jerusalem to the site of the embassy in West Jerusalem, making it more difficult still for Palestinians to relate to U.S. diplomats and other officials, and for U.S. officials to come to know them. We meet in the unique circumstances of religious freedom in the United States, where, thanks to the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, our two religious communities, as well as the Jewish community, have been able to flourish, and where we have come to know one another, and from time to time have collaborated with one another for the common good and the good of our respective communities. We're also cursed to live in a time when religious intolerance and xenophobia are in the ascendant. You, our Muslim brothers and sisters, have been the special victims of this hostility. Today, our poor cousins from Central America are once again its targets. Most of us here are the children of immigrants and refugees. We are the spiritual heirs of wanderers. Abraham was a wanderer. Jacob sojourned in Egypt. Moses wandered 40 years in the desert. Jesus' family took refuge in Egypt, and Muhammad endured an extended period of forced migration. Faced with public hostility to strangers driven from their homes, religious people must recall their kinship with migrants and asylum seekers. The book of Leviticus tells us you must treat the foreigner among you as native born and love him as yourself, because you were once foreigners in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. This is a message we must proclaim here in Washington and must make it echo in Jerusalem too. Treat the foreigner among you as native born and love him as yourself. The painful truth, of course, is that in Jerusalem the other is the Palestinian who is the rightful inhabitant of the land. I think of the last lines of Muhammad Darwish's poem, In Jerusalem. Woman soldiers shouted, "Is that you again? Didn't I kill you?" I said, "You killed me, and I forgot, like you, to die." Like the woman soldier, the Trump administration seems to think that Palestinians should be a people who have passed from history. After its assaults on refugees in the PA, is now aiming to speed the mortality of the sick and the vulnerable cared for by Christian and Muslim hospitals in East Jerusalem and neighboring Palestinian territory, where until now they have received support from the U.S. Yesterday, the bishops of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Episcopal Church, and the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops issued a joint statement protesting the administration's decision to end aid to the hospitals in East Jerusalem as part of a wider curtailment of funding that had been assisting Palestinian people for many years. These include Augusta Victoria Hospital, St. John of Jerusalem Eye Hospital, Princess Basma Rehabilitation Center, St. Joseph Hospital, as well as Maqasid Islamic Charitable Hospital and the Red Crescent Maternity Hospital. The apparent decision can only be described as malignantly cruel. The bishops quote a statement by Israeli doctors calling the decision a blow to the health of the city. The cuts, the doctor said, are a sudden and significant cut of support for medical services that will cause imminent and serious harm to the health and well-being of those residents of the city. Defense of these essential institutions should be the common cause of U.S. Christians, Muslims, and Jews, a step toward demanding a just settlement of the question of Palestine. Now let me return to the question of Christians and Muslims in the Middle East. With the advent of Islam in the 7th century, a common history and a common civilization has been united Christians and Muslims in the Arab Middle East. Arab civilization, in turn, enabled Muslim Christians of different cultures and languages, Greek, Coptics, Syriac, Chaldean, to know one another better and deepen their communion with one another. So the advent of Islam brought Christians together. In time, Arabic became not only the language of daily life, but also the language of theology and even of liturgy. The Arab milieu also yielded distinctive theological genius. Likewise, the tolerance fostered by the early Muslim caliphates in the Middle East and in Iberia permitted early development of serious Christian-Muslim dialogue. Free of the constraints of state confessionalism, once the norm in world affairs, American Muslims and American Christians benefit from the witness of the common life of our two families of faith in the Near East. The Catholic Patriarchs have affirmed that the dialogue of Arab Christians is primarily a dialogue with our Muslim brothers. Our common life over long centuries, they contend, represents a fundamental experience which we cannot disregard. They conclude it is the will of God for us and for them. Pope St. John Paul II believed that Jerusalem was gifted as the center of divine human encounter, the place where the unity of the human family will be achieved. In his apostolic letter, Redemptionis Anno, written for the holy year of 1984, the late Holy Father made the case that Jerusalem is the place where humanity finds its spiritual unity. He wrote, "As she is the homeland of the hearts of all the spiritual descendants of Abraham who hold her very dear, and the place where, according to faith, the created things of earth encounter the infinite transcendence of God, Jerusalem stands out as a symbol of coming together of union and of universal peace for the human family." The peace of Jerusalem, longed for by Jews, Christians, and Muslims, St. John Paul believed, was essential to peace in the Middle East. Thus he made his own the cry of Isaiah, "For Zion's sake I will not keep silent, and for Jerusalem's sake I will not rest until a vindication goes forth as brightness, and to salvation as a burning torch." He was convinced that the religious identity of the city, and particularly the common traditions of the monotheistic faith, can pave the way to promote harmony among all those who in different ways consider the holy city as their own. The establishment and safeguarding and defense of human rights of all the residents of Jerusalem is Palestinian and Israeli, Muslim and Christians and Jews, is integral to the worship of the one God in the holy city. It is in respecting and implementing those rights that we honor the dignity of others as members of God's one family. The sanctity of the human person, wrote the Catholic Patriarchs of the East, draw their sacred character from the holiness of God, who created humanity and has made it a recipient of rights and duties and given it a living conscience through which it can seek the truth and find it without fear. You often still hear people reduce religious rights in Jerusalem to the question of access to the holy places. That is still an issue, especially for Christians and Muslims from the West Bank and from Gaza. But for the Holy See, rights are understood much more broadly. They include equality of rights and treatment of those belonging to the communities of three religions found in the city in the context of freedom of spiritual, cultural, civic, and economic activities. Both individuals and communities must be able to live free and full lives, unimpeded by legal and administrative burdens to their activities. What the Church expects of Israeli authorities, Catholics also expect of Palestinian authorities. When Palestinians share in the governance of Jerusalem, there should be no repetition of the repressive policies alleged against the Palestinian Authority and Hamas authorities in Gaza in the most recent Human Rights Report. Finding a final status of Jerusalem, especially issues related to the Old City and the religious communities, must have strong outside involvement from the international community, but not from the United States, which has too long been what peace analysts call an outside partial participant, and is exceptionally these days an outside partial participant in failed peace processes. As Pope John Paul wrote in Redemptionis Annos, there should be found with goodwill and farsightedness a concrete and just solution to which different interests and aspirations can be provided in a harmonious and stable form, and be safeguarded in an adequate and efficacious manner by a special statute internationally guaranteed so that no party could jeopardize it. Let us pray with St. John Paul for the day on which we shall all be so taught by God that we shall listen to the message of peace and reconciliation. I think of that day in which Jews, Christians, and Muslims will greet each other in the city of Jerusalem, he said, with the same greeting and peace with which Christ greeted the disciples after the resurrection. Peace be with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father Drew. Your Excellency, Richard Graham, please come to the podium.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here this morning. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be at the end of the line, so to speak, because it's clear to me that the extent to which our presentations complement each other and in a way even copy each other. Although, Dr. Renwick, I have one little isolated issue here. As a much younger student, I lived in Strasbourg for a year, and I worshipped in the congregation where John Calvin got his start, so to speak. And I guarantee you that those Reformed Christians considered that to be holy ground, and any Lutheran quibbling with that was quickly dismissed. There is a very beautiful late 16th century English poem which goes by the name simply of Jerusalem. It's an anonymous poem, or at least all we seem to have in the tradition is the author's initials, FBP. People now mostly know the poem, if they know it at all, in a version sung as a hymn. From the first couple of stanzas, you would be able to guess much of the rest of the poem, at least if you had grown up singing this kind of thing as I did. Jerusalem, my happy home, when shall I come to thee? When shall my sorrows have an end? Thy joys when shall I see? O happy harbor of the saints, O sweet and blessed soil, in thee no sorrow may be found, no grief, no care, no toil. As you no doubt quickly determined by now, this poem is not about the earthly city of Jerusalem we have mostly come here today to talk about. It is about that other Jerusalem for which Christians hope, the Jerusalem which will be the center of the new heaven and the new earth, and which is even now, in some Christian thought at least, the place where God lives in this meantime and where God cares for the souls of the saints. Jerusalem, my happy home, would God I were in thee. Would God my woes were at an end, thy joys that I might see. And I mention all this here today because I think we must acknowledge that for many people, this heavenly Jerusalem that is yet to be revealed is Jerusalem. For many people, the actual Jerusalem of our times scarcely exists at all. And that is our problem, or at least it is part of our problem. People who have been taught everything there is to know about what Jerusalem might have looked like in King David's time, people who could draw from memory a map of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus, people who look forward with hope and passion to the great city described in the book of Revelation. Some of those people cannot easily imagine a real city called Jerusalem, not far from the Mediterranean, where the food and the cell phone service are both very good. Perhaps I exaggerate. I speak out of my own Lutheran Christian tradition, and in a sense, I think I speak to my own situation. It is a great thing that in Jerusalem and near it today there are vibrant Lutheran churches with wonderful ministries. And it is a sad thing that when groups of Lutheran pilgrims and tourists go to Jerusalem and go to Bethlehem, they are more likely to worship in their hotels or on their buses than to join their local Christian Lutheran brothers and sisters on Sunday. For pilgrims and tourists like that, Jerusalem is really just one big theme park, and even going there doesn't always change what they think. People who love the real Jerusalem of the here and now have a kind of public relations problem to address. But more than that, those of us who love the real Jerusalem of the here and now have a theological problem to address. We should stop teaching and preaching as if the history of the Holy Land ended when St. Paul set off for Rome. We should try to avoid speaking about Jerusalem as that ancient city. And we have to remember that when we talk about Jerusalem, we talk about it as a city which, with all its struggles, continues to have much to teach the world. For instance, those of us who want to live and who like to live in exciting, diverse places here in this country need to talk about Jerusalem as one of the world's great enduring models of just exactly that kind of exciting and diverse community. People who love the real Jerusalem of the here and now don't have to give up hopes of that city which is to come at the end of time. But we ought to realize, and you have heard this before already, we ought to realize that the hopes of the time to come throw light into the present. Our challenge is always to show by our best effort a glimpse of what God will ultimately bring to pass. What a great thing it would be if we could pursue in this moment the work of justice and of peacemaking, so that Jerusalem could indeed be a happy home for all the people who live there now and for the people who will come to live there in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop. Now is the time for a question and answer. If you would address your specific question to the person that may have shared your thoughts or provoked your question, as also we would like the questioner to come to the microphone. Is that you, Stephen, coming? Yes, it is.
Unless somebody would like to jump up, I'll go to second queue.
Come forth.
I'm very stimulated and challenged by the presentations here, and Reverend Redrick, you got my attention up quickly, and then my mind started to drift because I was having to think about things that you'd stimulated in me. And I wonder if the challenge on Jerusalem is when we do think about it as a place that is mapped, a place for the surveyor, a place for the GPS, when really what it is a maybe the grandest tapestry of all time that's been created and given to us as a different kind of map and puzzle to be solved. And I think your reference to people being there together reverently trying to live God's life as it was described to us is what makes the place holy. But isn't Jerusalem also one of the most unique laboratories with so much going for it that if we can't get something right there with all those pieces and that grand tapestry, how would we ever get it right anywhere? So Jerusalem as a functional opportunity and challenge rather than as a static thing of the past that we just preserve.
Who would like to deliver an answer or a comment on that? That was a comment, wasn't it? That wasn't a question.
I'm on a journey and I don't know where it's going.
Well, let me give you an insight. I have a neighbor in Jerusalem, a shopkeeper, a Muslim shopkeeper, and he belongs to the Book of Lamentations generally whenever I meet him, so I try to avoid him. But he looks at me occasionally, he said, "Holy city, it's only the ground that's holy, not the people." And see, this is a challenge, I think, in every nation and every country. We want others to do the thing for us, whatever that thing is. It's our responsibility to make Jerusalem a holy place. It's your responsibility to make your country what you desire it to be. If we wait for someone else to do it, we'll die waiting. So, as I would say to the Muslim man, I said, well, when are you going to decide to be a holy person in this city that you've said it's only the ground that's holy? Sure, we all know the historical gift that the city is, but it's drowning because we're drowning. We don't see things. I remember a preacher when I lived in Florida years ago, and he said this little thing: God fixes a fix to fix you. If you unfix the fix before you're fixed, he'll fix another fix to fix you. Right? Now, I learned when I lived in Alabama that fixing means a whole lot of things down there. I'm fixing to go to the airport, I'm fixing dinner, I'm fixing to get this. So I say to my friends in Jerusalem, I said, look, what in you needs repair? What up here needs to be fixed? Because God is going to use the struggles that you're having to get your attention. The wall is simply a symbol, and not simply, but it's more than that. It's a symbol, though, of the psychological walls that are within us. Now, when are we going to break this down, or are we going to fixate solely on what we see outside? So Jerusalem will only become, in fact, it's already in theory a holy city, but it'll only be a holy city in fact when we contribute to it a holiness that is our responsibility. And I don't mean a piety, but a robust sense of love and justice and truth. I found, I deal with several families in a different realm over there. I don't want to mention the subject, but I said, what's wrong with you? You're afraid to speak truth to family members. Oh, it's the Arab tradition. I said, well, then God's going to break it.
Hi, my name is George Hashemite. I'm a founding board member of the Palestinian Center here. It was a very interesting event today, particularly because I attended the first sessions. I doubt very much the media is going to cover this in a conference, but I have a suggestion which I've learned from the Washington Post, where I worked for 2 years on the staff. Get some of these statements that made by the first priest that I watched and advertise them in the paper. I noticed that many things have happened lately, they're advertised. Statements people made or opinions they wanted to publish. The Post is not a very, very big newspaper to have everybody's statement, but please, I think this is a very good idea, and I recommend it very highly. I'm a journalist, and you can't cover everything that goes on in town. Thank you.
Since you're on the board, hit Rateb on that one.
Okay.
Next questioner, please.
Thank you. My name is Nizar Farsakh. I'm actually from Birzeit, currently the chair of the board of the Museum of the Palestinian People here in DC. Thank you for your interventions. My question is about Jerusalem and what it means to people. It was mentioned also in the previous panel, what it means to people outside of Palestine and Israel. Like I remember when I was there, I lived in Palestine for 10 years, and I met people who were not religious, not part of any of the three monotheistic religions, and still they came in pilgrimage to Jerusalem because they felt there was this energy, right? So my question is that since Jerusalem, and I think Jerusalem is the only city I can think of that means so much to so many people that don't live there, right? And how consequential that on what happens there, that people revere Jerusalem and interfere in the politics of Jerusalem, despite the fact that they don't live there, and they're not going to live the consequences of what happens there. So from your experience, what is the best way to negotiate that relationship? What negotiators can do really politically in that city, and how do they negotiate that with people who are not there but are just as influential, if not more influential, than the people that are there? Thank you.
Panelists who would like to field that.
I'm not quite sure if I'm going to answer the question or the previous comment there. There's no question, and I don't mean to undermine this, the importance historically, the importance politically, the importance emotionally of Jerusalem. I think Bishop Graham's comments were really very much linked to what I was trying to get at, that there's a whole sphere within the Christian, various Christian traditions, including, as we've heard, not just my low church Presbyterian, but some Lutheran and many evangelical positions where Jerusalem is just symbolic, and the incarnational aspect is not there. I certainly, with my congregation, when we have gone on trips, try to balance the theological and the incarnational together so that we are dealing with real people and somehow bringing things back to a real city with real issues, as well as this place which has enormous symbolic value within our tradition. I don't know how to do that in any way except locally through my congregation. I'm not quite sure I'd have any answers for the broader population as a whole. I'm not quite sure that's an answer to your question, but
if I could add, the tension in a city like Jerusalem is a tension related to the fact that the city needs people to come there. The people that the city needs tourists, needs pilgrims, needs outside friends and companions, and then it has to function for the people who live there. That is not unlike Washington, D.C. That's not unlike some other places. There are other places in the world where the tension between making things work for people who come to visit and making things work for people who live there is a lived tension, you know? And that's another sense, it seems to me, in which if Jerusalem were understood correctly, it would make it a place that would be useful to all of us. Lessons drawn from the experience of the people who live and work and visit Jerusalem could bear fruit in lots of places. My friends in New York City get bitter occasionally about the fact that the city caters so much to people who come and bring money from outside and seems to punish some of the people who live there. So it's not just Jerusalem, but Jerusalem could be an outstanding example if it had the opportunity and the freedom to do that.
I think the place to begin in the U.S. is in dialogue with the liberal Jewish community, with the Reform and conservative communities, the Reconstructionist communities. And they increasingly find themselves on the same side as Christians who identify with their fellow Christians, or Muslims who identify with fellow Muslims in Palestine, and are being excluded by the Israeli government. Although the High Court recently admitted someone who had history of being critical of Israel. But there's been a real effort to try to prevent them from coming. But I think there's a real strength when the three traditions can come together. Joint pilgrimages would certainly be a way in which to do that. But I think joint witness in this country, especially when the administration is only buying an exclusivist vision of Israel.
Mm-hmm. Stephen.
Yeah, hi, Steve France. I'm affiliated with the Episcopal Peace Fellowship, and we're all here to consider ways in which the religious institutions and leaders of our country and the world can help Jerusalem. And there's been discussion of a task force here or a coalition helping Jerusalem. I would like you all to turn your attention, if possible, to looking at it from the other end of the telescope, if you will. And what does helping Jerusalem, or in that sense, Jerusalem, what does it do for our religious communities? For instance, on interfaith, there's a lot of interest in interfaith or interreligious development among the three Abrahamic and other faiths. With a task force, shouldn't it be something where Christians and Muslims and Jews are united with a task to perform, as opposed to just making nice and comparing notes? Likewise, maybe from Bishop Graham's mention of theme park Jerusalem, well, there's an element of theme park Christianity right in our own churches, right? I mean, people just park themselves in there and they have a little mini theme park religious experience if it doesn't go into the world. So again, helping Jerusalem would be something that is about the world. It's about real peace for real people. So is this not a great opportunity for our religious communities to revive themselves and to invigorate themselves?
We take that as not entirely a rhetorical question. No, I think that is certainly true. I do think that the notion that this could be something that included our Jewish neighbors and friends as well would carry a lot of power. And I do think that is something that we need to explore. And this organization is an excellent platform for that, it seems to me.
And I think that this issue of the hospitals, which I briefly mentioned, in which the three churches, or three of the churches, that they're not all Orthodox churches aren't, but the three Western churches in Jerusalem have written, and their American counterparts have written a letter, would it be a place to begin, but begin by bringing in Muslim and Jewish compatriots as well. It seems to me that whenever you do it together, it's better, and it seems to me we're at a stage where that can happen. We're talking today about a common home for Muslims and Christians, but a common home with Jews, and it seems to me that therefore the work needs to be conceived of in that way.
Next question.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the wonderful presentations. They were fabulous and inspiring. And the reference to Mahmoud Darwish that you just made was also particularly inspiring. My name is Shahr Awaudi. I'm the Deputy Ambassador of the OIC, and I'm Muslim from Bethlehem. There is some aspect that is not usually referred to when you talk about Jerusalem, which is actually an aspect of the tragedy of Palestinians living around Jerusalem, like myself. We have a whole generation in the West Bank who have never been to Jerusalem. If you like, you just book your ticket and go, and you be there in a few hours. If you want to visit a friend in South Carolina, you just get your car. What you care about is just if you have fuel, gas or not, and then you drive. But for us, going to Jerusalem, I'm from Bethlehem. Jerusalem is just 10 minutes away from my home. I cannot go. A few years ago, I had my son, who was 7 years old at that time. He was so excited when we flew from Toronto to Amman, and he was excited about going to Jerusalem. It was not so easy to go to Jerusalem. I tried to explain to him. Our holiday was 46 days. We applied to get an Israeli permit to go to Jerusalem. We kept waiting for more than 40 days, and then they gave us the permits, and they were annotated, you cannot sleep in Jerusalem, you can't spend the night in Jerusalem. So I took the family, we went to Jerusalem. prayed, visited the sites, and then we had to leave. But the son didn't like to leave. He wanted to spend the night in Jerusalem. I had to explain to him, but of course, explaining the facts to him is just explaining the Middle East politics and the conflict to him. That was not easy. So I just told him, why don't you follow the footsteps of Jesus? He used to teach and preach during the daylight in Jerusalem, but he has never spent a single night in the city. So thank you so much.
Good, thank you. Thank you for that touch of light humor. It does lift up the spirit a little bit, doesn't it? Anyone with any more questions, comments?
Let me just follow up on that. I don't have any doubt whatsoever that the situation in Jerusalem and with the West Bank is a huge problem. I see smaller versions of the problem in other places. I've told Rateb, whenever I arrive, and the 4 or 5 times I've been to the airport in Tel Aviv, or when I leave from there, I get searched every time. I was born in Malaysia, which is a Muslim country. I go up in the line, they see my US passport, they greet me warmly, and then the guy looks a little more carefully. He sees where I was born, and he says, just wait a minute. And he goes, and he finds somebody else, and he says, come with me, every time. And so that happens to me as well. I have been stuck in Toronto trying to get into the United States, and have been grilled by American immigration officials when I didn't have the right visa. And even though I was married to an American and was just about prevented if I didn't have one other document with me. So I've been through some of these in other cases. It's clearly exacerbated in the West Bank, and it is horrible. In terms of helping people understand, if I force the issue in our present political climate, I will get pushback. The best educational moment I've experienced, which comes back to your experience with Bethlehem being separated, was with a group from one of my churches visiting Bethlehem and coming back to Jerusalem, and they forgot to put us in the special tourist way through the wall. And we ended up in the middle of everyday Palestinians trying to get into Jerusalem for an hour and a half or more, maybe 2 hours. We were there. And once we were in, we couldn't get out. They couldn't get us out because we were in the middle. And the conversations that took place inside the wall, and people may not realize, you are inside this fortress wall. I could never have preached. I could never have taught. They happened there. And for me, in terms of how do you communicate, nothing beats those back to the everyday connections with people. And people left with a completely different view, which if I had said, you got to take this on head on, they would never have caught. Doctors, construction workers, others inside, they said, what a mix of people. And those stories came across. And really changed people's attitudes in a way that other things might not have done. But everyday circumstances suddenly hit home, and the common humanity, as you have described, came through powerfully, and not just anecdotally, powerfully into people's lives.
Next question, please. My name is Mark Burzynski. I'm a journalist here in Washington. And I've heard a lot of interesting theological discussion this morning, historical discussion this morning. Everybody has all these hopes about what's going to happen, but I've heard almost no discussion about, so what can we do about what the Israelis are doing to Jerusalem? And there is a movement that started in Palestine about 10 years ago. It's spread around the world. Whether one agrees with it or not, at least outside of this conference, people are talking about it. That's the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And yet I've heard nobody even mention it, not to mention the fact that you haven't invited anybody on your program to speak about it. We can't just talk about what our hopes are. We have to talk about what we're going to do about what's actually happening. Why are we not talking about that?
If I could respond to that, I was not asked to talk about it. And in my church, I'm very clear as to what I'm talking about and when I'm talking about it. And if I stray across boundaries, and one of those is theological and political, without telling people where I'm going, I find that you get into enormous difficulties. So I personally want to be very careful. Now, if on a different situation I was asked to speak about that, then maybe I would speak about that, but that's not what I was asked to speak about. I would think that in the rest of the conference there may well be opportunities for that, but my understanding was that I was specifically asked to give a theological reflection on this situation, which I actually happen to think has profound political ramifications. Where one finds holiness is an enormous theological question with massive social and political ramifications. So I don't think it's not political, but it was very clear what I was asked to do. So I'm not quite sure I'm going to stray into BDS right now, but that's why at this table that has not been the conversation. If you look at the program, I think there are other.
I would say that I've changed my position on BDS personally. I don't think you'll find the American Catholic Church backing BDS because our relationships with the Jews following Vatican II has been so important to our identity and our ongoing ecumenical activity. But I don't think that the church's position excludes individuals. I attended, I was on a panel with a Presbyterian and a Methodist at a group that calls itself the Council for the Committee for the Republic a couple of years ago about this, and I was asked about why aren't Catholics here, and I said it's because we have that relationship. But on the other hand, I think personally it changed, and I think for myself, giving it greater consideration has been propelled by this whole series of developments in the administration's policy over the past 6 months. One by one, attacking the Palestinian refugees, Palestinians in general, now the sick, basically kicking people and stamping on people who are on the ground already. And, if it needs a stronger response, then we've been giving it. And so I think BDS is, it's worth standing up to the criticism that you're delegitimating Israel. I don't think BDS is about it. Some of the organizations that propose it, proponents, do want to delegitimate Israel. That's not my intent, and if I supported it, it will be through groups that are clear that they don't want to delegitimate Israel, but its policies towards Palestine, yes.
And I would say that Lutherans are, this is a very touchy issue for Lutherans because we remember vividly that the Holocaust started in Lutheran country, or at least in a place that had a large number of Lutherans. So the argument has been with us, this was not a direction that the church wanted to go, although individuals have made that choice. On the other hand now, the Lutheran community in the United States is very touchy about what's called Augusta Victoria Hospital in East Jerusalem. The decision on the part of the government not to continue the funding for health care in that particular place is likely to push, I think, my denomination in a stronger direction than it has gone. The Augusta Victoria is a very big deal for us and has been an outpost of Lutheran ministry in that area since forever, as far as we know. And I would think that the next round, our annual meetings, our conferences, our synod assemblies are in June and May usually. And it'll be interesting to see what happens this year with respect to the issue you raise, simply because of the government's behavior about health care.
Since we have a final question here before lunch.
Good morning or good afternoon. Well, I'm Mauri Sagnay, and I'm just a humble Catholic, willing and able to help. I would like to know if I should go to my pastor and say, what can I do? What programs do you have to help and support the Holy Land? So that's it. Thank you.
Good. Thank you.
I have one suggestion. A Canadian member of Parliament came to our office in Jerusalem wanting to know. He really didn't want to know. He just came to tell us what he thinks we should know. So he was of Irish descent, and I being Irish as well. I said to him, let me suggest something to you and to all your other members of parliament, and maybe you can do this with congressional representatives and senators. I said, look, would you do this? Take 1 year out of Canadian parliament and live in this country without security, without boasting who you are, without identity, and go through the checkpoints and the humiliations of the people every day. Then I will be able to trust your input into Parliament as to your future votes on this country. If you want to challenge your representatives to do things like that and say, you have no credibility until you go and live there. I had no credibility when I went there at first, but having lived there 19 years, I have a very different dialogue and story to report whenever I get the opportunity to do that. So if you want to do something that's not necessarily part of an organized group like BDS, go directly to your representative and challenge them. And don't take no for an answer. Say, I'll be at your door tomorrow morning and tomorrow morning until I get a hearing from you. That would be my practical suggestion on that level. Any questions or any further comments before we hit the lunch table? Looks like everyone is satisfied. Thank you so much. Lunch is being served outside. Thank you, speakers.
Nice to see you.
Yeah.
Nice to see you.
Good to be with you. Good to see you again.
Nice to see you again. We could have given each other speeches, I think. We could have.
Well, it was wonderful, but they were from slightly different directions, but
Yeah, no, it was good.
much
Yeah,
the same.
yeah, it's completely right. And I skipped the passion where it was passage where I talked about it's not the place, it's the people.
Yeah.
just to be within the time limit. Yeah.
Exactly.
So,
And it's always a mix.
Yeah.
So I was giving my extreme
Right,
view
right,
there,
yeah.
coming back. But your discussion on BDS is very much mine. That are they close to apartheid? You bet they're very close to
That's
apartheid.
right.
Do I wish there was something stronger? Yes, but will it actually work? Well,
Well, I heard-
the law of unintended consequences.
Well, that's the law about it.
Given
That's
anti-Semitism.
that's the problem.
It's just huge.
That's a huge problem. On the other hand, I hear that it is making progress these days.
Yeah.
I remember some people the other night said, yeah, BDS, much to people's surprise, is gaining traction. I think because the Israeli policy is just so, and now the administration policy, are just so recalcitrant. I mean, they're just, you know.
And they do need a buffer. I mean, if there's no buffer from the U.S. government, then they'll head down a worse road.
That's right. That's right. Did you celebrate Reformation Sunday last week?
Oh, we do. We don't make a huge,
Okay.
huge deal of it.
I've spoken up there a couple of times for Reformation Sunday.
I certainly give credence to, especially focused on God's call for every one of us.